In the winter of 1873, homesteaders along the Dakota frontier watched as a widow began construction on what appeared to be the strangest building they had ever seen. While her neighbors built simple cabins or dugouts carved into hillsides, this woman was building a barn directly over her existing log cabin. The other settlers thought she had lost her mind. They whispered that grief had broken her judgment. Some even offered to help her build a proper structure, assuming she didn't understand basic carpentry. But this woman wasn't confused. She was solving a problem that would nearly kill half her neighbors before spring arrived. Her name was Margaret Heler, and she had already survived one Dakota winter as a widow with 3 young children. That first winter taught her something the other homesteaders hadn't yet learned. The land could provide everything you needed to survive, but only if you understood how to work with it instead of against it. The Northern Plains in the 1870s were not forgiving territory. The Homestead Act had brought thousands of families west with promises of free land, but the reality was far harsher than the pamphlet suggested. Winters arrived early and stayed late. Temperatures dropped to 30 and 40 below zero. Snow didn't just fall, it came sideways in walls of white that erased the horizon. And the wind never stopped. It pushed through every gap in every wall. Searching for warmth to steal, most homesteaders built their cabins using the timber from creek bottoms, precious wood that had to be hauled, sometimes 10 or 15 miles. These logs became walls, roofs, and most importantly, firewood. A family might burn through 3 or 4 cords of wood in a single winter. Running out of firewood didn't just mean discomfort. It meant death. Margaret had learned this lesson. In her first winter, her husband had cut and stacked wood before he died in a farming accident that autumn. The pile looked enormous in September. By January, it was half gone. By March, she was burning furniture. The children slept together under every blanket they owned, while Margaret fed the stove with chair legs and floorboards. When the thaw finally came, she walked through her damaged cabin and made a decision. She would never be cold like that again. The problem wasn't just the amount of wood, it was what happened to the wood during winter. Snow piled 4 and 5 feet deep around every homestead. The carefully stacked firewood disappeared under drifts. When you needed wood, you had to dig for it. And when you finally uncovered a log, it was soaked through with melting snow and ice. What wood doesn't burn? It smolders and fills your cabin with smoke. It wastes precious kindling. Worst of all, it cools down your stove right when you need heat the most. Margaret spent that spring thinking about the Scandinavian farmers she had known back east. They built their barns attached to their houses, sometimes even housing animals in the same structure. The animals provided warmth. The shared walls saved materials, and everything stayed dry under one continuous roof. But more than that, she remembered something else. These farmers kept their winter supplies inside the barn itself. Hay, grain, tools, and yes, firewood. Everything they needed stayed dry and accessible, even in the deepest snow. So Margaret began her unusual construction project. She didn't tear down her cabin. Instead, she extended the walls upward and outward, creating a larger structure that completely enclosed the original building. The cabin became the center room of a barn. She built the barn walls using sod bricks, thick chunks of prairie earth, held together by deep grass roots. Sod was free, plentiful, and remarkably good at holding heat. She timbered a new roof that covered everything, sloping to shed snow and rain away from the structure. When she finished, the result looked strange. To her neighbors, from the outside, it appeared to be a large sod barn. But inside was her cabin, now protected within a larger shell. Between the cabin walls and the barn walls, she created a walking space about 6 feet wide on all sides. This is where she stacked her firewood, cords and cords of it, all under the barn roof, completely protected from snow and rain. The other homesteaders mocked the design. They said she had wasted materials and labor. They called it Heler's double house and made jokes about a woman trying to do a man's work. Margaret ignored them. She spent the summer and fall cutting wood and filling the space between her cabin and barn walls. By the time the first snow fell in late October, She had enough dry firewood to last 2 winters, all of it and arm's length from her cabin door. The winter of 1873 to 74 became one of the worst in recorded history for the northern plains. The snow began in November and barely stopped until March. Temperatures stayed below zero for weeks at a time. The wind created drifts that buried entire cabins. Supply wagons couldn't get through. Families were isolated for months. Margaret and her children stayed warm. Every morning, she simply opened her cabin door and selected dry logs from the protected space around her home. She never had to dig through snow. She never had to dry out frozen wood. She never had to ration heat. The double wall design created an insulating airspace that kept the cabin warmer even when the stove burned low at night. The saw walls of the outer barn held heat like thick blankets. Her neighbors suffered. By January, families all along the creek were running low on accessible firewood. Their outdoor wood piles had disappeared under snow. Men risked frostbite digging through drifts to find frozen, useless logs. Some families burned their fences. Others burned dried buffalo chips when they could find them under the snow. Two families lost children to the cold. An elderly couple didn't make it through February. As spring arrived and the snow finally melted, the surviving homesteaders came to look at Margaret's barn cabin. They walked around the structure slowly, understanding now what they had mocked 6 months earlier. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. She hadn't just built shelter. She had built a system that worked with the harsh environment instead of fighting it. Word spread through the territory. Over the next few years, more homesteaders began adapting Margaret's design. Some built full barns over their cabins like she had. Others simply added lean-to structures against their cabin walls to create protected storage for wood. The farmers who raised livestock built connected barns and used the animal heat to warm their homes. These combined structures became common enough that they stopped seeming strange. The principle Margaret understood was something indigenous peoples across the northern regions had known for centuries. Survival in extreme cold isn't about fighting the elements with force. It's about creating layers of protection. It's about keeping your resources dry and accessible. It's about planning in summer for the worst that winter can bring. Most importantly, it's about observation. Margaret watched, learned, and adapted. She saw a problem and thought carefully about solutions that others had used in different places. Then she made it work for her circumstances. The barn cabin design also taught homesteaders something subtle but important about prairie architecture. The thick saw walls, the protected air spaces, the consideration of wind and snow patterns. All of these elements came from respecting the power of the environment. The settlers who succeeded weren't the ones who tried to recreate their eastern farmhouses on the plains. They were the ones who learned from the land itself and built accordingly. Margaret raised her children in that barn cabin. She later remarried and expanded the structure even more, adding actual livestock space and a proper hearth. The building stood for over 40 years. By the time it was finally abandoned in the early 1900s, it had sheltered 3 generations through some of the harshest winters the Dakota territory ever recorded. And in all those years, the firewood stayed dry. The story matters because it shows us something we often forget about survival and adaptation. The most important tool isn't strength or even courage. It's the willingness to observe, to think, and to do things differently when the old ways aren't working. Margaret could have built a bigger wood pile and hoped for the best. She could have rationed more carefully. Instead, she solved the real problem. The wood wasn't getting to the fire, so she made sure the wood stayed dry and close. Frontier history is full of stories like this, quieter than battles or gold rushes, but just as important. Someone sees a problem, they think about it carefully. They create a solution that seems odd at first, but works perfectly for the specific challenge. Then that solution spreads because survival favors good ideas over tradition. The barn cabin isn't used anymore. Modern heating and insulation solve the firewood problem in different ways. But the principle remains. When you face harsh conditions, pay attention to the details that matter most. Stay dry, stay warm. Keep your resources accessible. Build with the environment instead of against it. These lessons kept people alive on the frontier. They still work today in any situation where survival depends on preparation, observation, and the humility to learn from the land around.